Number 1.
Kimball's family members initially noticed something was amiss with his behavior after the sudden death of his father in 1982, when he was 13 years old. He seemed unaffected by the loss. He was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in 1985. Kimball was hospitalized several times and had several relapses and recoveries throughout the years. He was able to graduate from high school and hold several jobs throughout the years while taking his medications. Kimball eventually moved into the Community Living Center, a halfway house in Maywood, Illinois, approximately 10 miles from his family's Oak Park, Illinois residence. Kimball visited his family's home near Jackson Boulevard and Scoville Avenue during Easter weekend in April 1993. He became angry when technical problems developed with the family's stereo system on April 13. One of his brothers asked him if he wanted to go to the hospital. Kimball declined and said he was going to take a walk. He never returned to the house and has not been heard from again. Kimball's family members initiated an extensive search for him immediately after he was reported missing. His relatives learned that he stopped reporting to work shortly after he walked away from the family's home. An Indiana law enforcement officer discovered a young man matching Kimball's description outside of South Bend, Indiana in March 1994, nearly 1 year after Kimball's disappearance. The officer said that the man was in a confused state and was wandering aimlessly around the area. The individual was given a sobriety test, as the officer believed the man may have been intoxicated. The person was released after passing the test. The officer saw a flyer posted by Kimball's family shortly after the incident and realized that the person may have been Kimball. South Bend, Indiana is approximately 90 miles from Kimball's family's Oak Park residence. Authorities believe that Kimball may have been taken against his will. Maywood, Illinois authorities are handling the investigation.
Number 2.
Donald was last seen on August 6, 1956. He was accompanied by a friend, Brenda Jo Howell, at the time. The two of them rode their bicycles to the San Gabriel Canyon area near Glendora Mountain Road and disappeared. A days later, Donald's jacket and Brenda's bicycle were found near Morris Dam, a quarter of a mile south of where they were last seen. Donald's bicycle was located a month later. Neither of the children have been heard from again. Authorities initially believed the children had run away from home, but later events altered their opinion. In 1970, Mac Ray Edwards pleaded guilty to killing 3 California children and sentenced to death at his own request. He subsequently confessed to the murders of 3 others, including Donald, Brenda and Roger Madison. Edwards directed investigators to a site where he said he had disposed of their bodies, but a search of the area turned up no signs of any remains. Edwards was never charged in connection with any other cases due to lack of evidence. He died by suicide on death row in 1971. A photograph of Edwards is posted with this case summary. Brenda was his sister-in-law, and Donald was one of his neighbors. 2 other children disappeared from the San Gabriel Mountains in the 1950s and 1960s. The others are Bruce Creeman and Thomas Bowman. Authorities believe Edwards was most likely responsible for their disappearances, as well as the disappearances of Ramona Price and Karen Tompkins. His alleged victims ranged in age from 7 to 16 years old. Donald lived with his parents in the 5700 block of Rockdale Avenue in Azusa, California in 1956. Foul play is suspected in his case due to the circumstances involved. His case was reopened in 2007 as authorities renewed the search for the bodies of Edwards' victims. He was employed as a heavy equipment operator in the 1950s and 1960s and helped construct many highways across the state of California. Investigators believe he may have buried the children's remains under the highways.
Number 3.
Dietz was last seen riding his bike home from the Meijer store in Saranac, Michigan on September 8, 2007. He has never been heard from again. When his family checked his home, nothing appeared to be missing except for some financial papers. Dietz is described as a meek, vulnerable individual who avoided contact with other people. At the time of his disappearance, he lived in a trailer on a remote 20-acre property on Eddy Road near the Ionia State Game area. He was known locally as the Bicycle Man because he used a bicycle as his primary mode of transportation, even during the winter, although he owned a car. He had amassed nearly $450,000 in his bank accounts and often talked about it and how he would like to invest it, but he lived a frugal lifestyle, even patching his shoes with duct tape. His family said he was raised in an institution and had always been extremely shy. They believed he was autistic, but he was never formally diagnosed with the condition. A week prior to his disappearance, Dietz had his biannual haircut and told the barber he was afraid for his life because someone wanted him to invest his money, would not take no for an answer, and was becoming threatening. He said he had given the man access to his bank accounts and the man had visited his home and he thought the man might be following him. On September 19, Rami Iqbal Saba tried to forge Dietz's signature to remove nearly $500,000 from Dietz's bank account and put it into an account in Saba's native Lebanon. A photograph of Saba is posted with this case summary. Authorities discovered he had stolen Dietz's identity, representing himself as the missing man and cashing thousands of dollars worth of checks in Dietz's name after Dietz disappeared. On September 30, a man claiming to be Dietz called Dietz's brother. He stated he had gotten a girl pregnant and had planned to travel to Greece with her, but he had a stroke. He asked the brother for help in getting money out of Dietz's bank account. The caller spoke with a foreign accent, and Dietz's brother, who knew Dietz had never been involved with a woman in his life, realized something was wrong. When he asked the caller to prove his identity by providing Dietz's mother's maiden name, the caller hung up. In December 2007, authorities searched Saba's Lowell, Michigan home and arrested him. He was charged with mail fraud, bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. These charges are unconnected with Dietz's disappearance. In January 2009, prosecutors unsealed an indictment against Saba's longtime friend, Reogo Uedreogo. Uedreogo is a native of the West African nation of Burkina Faso, but he was living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania when he was arrested. He faced the same charges as Saba. A photo of Uedreogo is posted with this case summary. Authorities believe the two men worked together to kidnap Dietz, incapacitate him, assume his identity and steal his money. Uedraogo flew to Grand Rapids, Michigan late in the evening on September 11, 2007, 3 days after Dietz's disappearance, and checked into a hotel the next afternoon. He's been unable to verify his whereabouts during the 14 hours between the time his plane landed and the time he arrived at the hotel. In July 2009, Uedreogo and Saba were additionally charged with kidnapping resulting in death and conspiracy to commit murder for hire. The suspects are both biologists with doctorates in their fields and without prior criminal histories. They met each other while attending graduate school in Belgium. Saba allegedly admitted the murder to other inmates in jail and said it wasn't planned. He converted to Islam after his arrest, fired his attorneys and defended himself during his own trial, saying Allah would protect him. He was convicted in June 2011 and sentenced to 32 years in prison. Uedreogo was convicted of Dietz's murder before Saba in April 2011. In December, however, the judge who presided over his trial overturned the verdict and issued a judgment of acquittal. In her 36-page ruling, she said there was no evidence to link Uedreogo to Dietz, either directly or through Saba, and the sole case against Uedreogo seemed to be that he was a close friend of Saba's. The prosecution appealed the ruling, and the appeals court didn't reverse the murder acquittal but did reinstate the charge of conspiracy to commit murder for hire. Uedreogo was convicted of that charge and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He maintains his innocence. Dietz is a retired Amway worker. He was a non-drinker at the time of his 2007 disappearance and never married. Authorities have never recovered his body. Foul play is suspected in his case due to the circumstances involved.
Number 4.
Leppert left her family's home in Rockledge, Florida at 11 a.m. on July 6, 1983, with a 20-year-old male friend. She said she was going to the beach and would be back in a little while. She never returned home. Her friend later told authorities that he and Leppert had an argument while driving and that he left her standing in a parking lot outside the Glass Bank near an Exxon gasoline station in the vicinity of State Road A1A between 2nd Street North and 3rd Street North in Cocoa Beach, Florida. Many reports erroneously state that Leppert was barefoot at the time of her disappearance. Her mother said she noticed she had not combed her hair before leaving the house that day, which is very uncharacteristic of her. She usually spent considerable time on her appearance before going anywhere. At the time of her disappearance, Leppert was planning to go to California to act in some movies. She apparently never arrived there, however. Investigators looked into the possibility that Leppert was attacked by Christopher Wilder, a man linked to at least a dozen disappearances, rapes, murders and/or attacks of women in the early to mid-1980s. Photos of Wilder are posted with this case summary. He frequented the Florida region at the time of Leppert's disappearance. He sometimes attempted to lure young female victims by offering non-existent modeling sessions or other tactics, which would have fit well into a scenario involving Leppert. She was a relatively known model who had won several titles and was an occasional actress, landing bit parts in the films Scarface and Spring Break, and she wanted to be an internationally famous star. Wilder, whose history of violence towards women went back to his adolescent years, was put on probation in 1980 after pleading guilty to attempted sexual battery towards a teenage girl. While on a visit home to Australia that same year, he was charged with kidnapping and sexually assaulting two teenage girls. His parents bailed him out of jail, and he flew back to the United States, promising to return for his trial, which was set for April 1984. Wilder is also a suspect in the Florida disappearances of Mary Opitz, Rosario Gonzalez, and Elizabeth Kenyon. He was killed during a shootout with authorities in 1984. Leppert's family filed a $1 million lawsuit against Wilder before his death, but dropped the suit afterwards. Leppert's mother, modeling agent Linda Curtis, later stated that she never believed Wilder was involved in Leppert's disappearance. Police have never been able to link Wilder and Leppert, and it may be coincidence that she disappeared at the same time he was targeting area models. He had a long history of sex crimes, but did not begin his killing spree until a year after Leppert vanished. John Brennan Crutchley, the so-called vampire rapist, is also considered a possible suspect in Leppert's case and in the 1985 disappearance of Patty Lou Valansky from Mims, Florida. He was sentenced to life in prison in 1986 for kidnapping and raping a woman in Orlando, Florida. He drained half her blood and drank it. Crutchley died by suicide in prison in 2002. Authorities have never been able to link him to Leppert or Valansky's disappearances. A photo of Crutchley is posted with this case summary. Curtis criticized the police for allegedly mishandling the investigation into Leppert's disappearance. Police initially believed she ran away, and some continue to think that foul play was not involved in her case. Curtis said her daughter was afraid of the man who last saw her and that the individual was never properly investigated. Authorities say they did the best they could to find Leppert, and the man she was last seen with has been interviewed is not a viable suspect in her case. On June 1, a month before Leppert vanished, she began acting erratically at her home. She yelled and screamed, broke a window with a baseball bat, and accused family and friends of trying to poison her. Curtis took Leppert to a mental health center for a 72-hour observation after she calmed down. Psychiatrists there could not find anything wrong with her, and a toxicology screen on her blood and urine turned up no indication of drug use. Curtis planned to find a therapist for Leppert, but she disappeared before that could be arranged. Curtis believed that Leppert may have been kidnapped and murdered as a result of her knowledge of a large-scale drug and money laundering operation in Brevard, Florida. The operation allegedly involved many prominent local citizens. Leppert was reportedly afraid for her life because of what she knew. She stayed in her bedroom more than usual and refused to drink from open containers or eat from her own plate. Curtis claimed Leppert made a police report about what she knew, but investigators have no record of the report and do not espouse Curtis's theory. Curtis moved to Orlando, Florida after her daughter's disappearance. She died in 1995. Leppert's sister is still looking for her and believes her mother's theory about Leppert's disappearance. Leppert's dental records have been lost. Some agencies incorrectly state that her home is in Cocoa Beach, Florida.
Number 5.
Amy was last seen hitchhiking along Main Highway in Coconut Grove, Florida on March 5, 1974. She was headed to her father's office to borrow money from him so she could meet friends later in the day. Amy never arrived at the office, and her friends never saw her that evening. She has never been heard from again. Amy enjoyed playing the flute and guitar, as well as reading and writing poetry, at the time of her 1974 disappearance, and was considering becoming an actress. She often hitchhiked through her neighborhood. Charles and Larry Glasser, 16-year-old twin brothers, called Amy's family a few days after her disappearance and claimed to have kidnapped her. They said they were holding her for $30,000 ransom. The Glassers turned out to be lying. They did not know Amy and had nothing to do with her disappearance. They were subsequently charged with extortion. Amy's mother, Susan Billig, began investigating her daughter's case in addition to law enforcement's attempts immediately after Amy disappeared. Photographs of Susan are posted with this case summary. She began receiving tips from numerous individuals who claimed that Amy had been abducted by members of the Outlaws or the Pagans, both motorcycle gangs that traveled through the Coconut Grove area of Florida in 1974. Some people claimed that Amy was alive, and others maintained she had been killed. These tips led Susan on a cross-country chase through the US and even into Great Britain through the years. Sometimes Susan would seemingly come within days of finding her daughter, but Amy was never located. She may have used the aliases Mute, Sunshine, Little Bits, and/or Mellow Cheryl while with the bikers. Paul Branch, a member of the Pagans, initially told Susan in the late 1970s that Amy was alive and being held by Pagan members. Branch's widow claimed he recanted this statement on his deathbed in the late 1990s. He then said that Amy had attended a party thrown by Pagans in Florida on the night of her disappearance and died of a drug overdose, and that her body had been taken to the Florida Everglades by gang members and tossed to the alligators. His widow relayed this information to Susan. Amy's camera was located at the Wildwood exit on Florida's Turnpike shortly after Amy's disappearance. It was turned in by a man who had heard she was missing. Wildwood would have been on the route the biker gangs took traveling north. Nobody knows if Amy had the camera when she disappeared, however, it might have disappeared before she did. The film Inside, once developed, revealed no clues as to her whereabouts. The majority of the photographs were completely overexposed. Another side note to Amy's disappearance involved harassing phone calls that Susan began receiving shortly after Amy vanished in 1974. A then unidentified male caller informed Susan that Amy was abducted by members of an illicit sex ring organization and being held captive. The caller tormented Susan for 21 years until 1995, when FBI agents were able to trace a call the man made using his cellular phone. Until that time, the caller always used a payphone to harass Susan, making him difficult to apprehend. The caller was identified as Henry Johnson Blair, who worked for the U.S. Customs Department. A photograph of him is posted with this case summary. Blair claimed that he was an alcoholic and had an obsessive-compulsive disorder which caused him to harass Susan. He also stated that he never met Amy and knew nothing about her disappearance. Blair was sentenced to a 2-year prison term for harassing Susan and has since been released. Susan settled a lawsuit against him for $5 million. The addition of Blair into this case focuses renewed attention onto a man Amy described in her journal. Amy wrote that she was considering running away to South America with a man she called Hank. Blair's nickname is Hank. A photo developed from a roll of film in Amy's camera showed a white van which was identical in color and model to a van Blair drove in 1974. Blair's job with the Customs Department required him to relocate to South America around the time Amy specified in her journal. Blair has not been positively linked to Amy aside from his incarceration for the harassment of her mother, however. The A&E network aired a program about Amy's case on its investigative reports series in 1998. The documentary shows elements of Susan's decades-long search for her daughter with law enforcement and also provides footage of Susan's meeting with Branch's widow. Susan accepts his widow's statement at the program's end, but authorities believe that his widow was lying about his confession in an effort to financially profit from Amy's disappearance. Amy's father died of lung cancer in the early 1990s. Susan co-authored a book about Amy's disappearance in 2001 with Greg Onapu called Without a Trace. The disappearance of Amy Billig, a mother's search for justice. She died in 2005 at age 80. Amy's case remains unsolved.
Number 6.
Shane was last seen at the Martin Luther King Jr. Towers Playground located at 113th Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem in the New York borough of Manhattan on August 10, 1989. He was accompanied by his mother, Rosa Glover. While she was sitting on a bench, a 10-year-old girl and her 5-year-old brother asked for permission to play with Shane, saying they didn't mind that he was very young. She said they could play. While Shane and the 2 children were playing on the slide, an African-American man approached Glover and began a conversation with her. He spoke about crime and mentioned kidnapping, saying things happen to children, and pointed to scars on himself which he said were from fighting. Glover became distracted while speaking to the man, and when she turned back to look for Shane, he was gone, and so were the children he had been playing with. The 2 children re-entered the park through a hole in the fence a short time later. They told Shane's mother they'd left him in the park. Glover immediately took the children to the police station to report her son missing. The police questioned the children extensively and also interviewed the man who spoke to Shane's mother. They looked into the possibility that Shane was taken by a member of his own family, but concluded he had probably been abducted by a non-relative. He has never been heard from again. Police stated they were seeking an unidentified man for questioning. He is described as African American, 19 to 24 years old, 5'8" tall, wearing a yellow shirt and acid-wash jeans. Shane's case shares striking similarities with the disappearance of Christopher Dansby, who disappeared from the same area of the same playground in May 1989, 3 months before Shane did. Both boys were African American toddlers and lived in the same apartment building. Both disappeared on the same day of the week, Thursday, at roughly the same time of day, Shane at 5 p.m. and Christopher at 7 p.m. In addition, just before his disappearance, Christopher was playing the same two children who were with Shane when he was last seen. Police still aren't sure whether the cases are related, however. Authorities investigated the possibility that the boys' cases were connected to a black market baby ring operation and that the infant Andre Bryant, who was abducted from Brooklyn in March 1989, was possibly another victim. All of the children are African American. Shane's parents both still live in the same neighborhood he disappeared from, and his mother hopes he is still alive and will return to her. His case remains unsolved.
Number 7.
Lewis came home from school and told his babysitter that he was going to walk 2 doors from his family's house in the 300 block of Chew Street to play with friends during the afternoon of June 7, 1984 in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Witnesses observed Lewis walking between 4th Street and Gordon Street, about a block from his second-floor apartment home in the 360 block of Chew Street, but what happened to him afterwards is unclear. The owner of Marco's Doggy Shop, a local hot dog stand, stated that Lewis came in at 4 p.m. and spent approximately 45 minutes browsing around the store. Lewis told the shop owner that he was in the store to avoid some teenage boys who were chasing him. He left at 4:45 p.m. and walked east on Gordon Street that afternoon. His parents believe he may have been headed for the Chew Street home of an elderly woman he liked to visit. The 2 boys who were chasing Lewis that day were later interviewed by law enforcement and are not thought to have been involved in his disappearance. Another witness claimed to have seen Lewis talking to an unidentified man and woman in a park near Jordan Creek, approximately 1 block from his residence, at approximately 4:30 p.m. This area was about 1 block away from Lewis's residence. The story was not confirmed, but it has not been ruled out as a possible scenario either. Lewis has never been heard from again. Lewis's parents did not report him missing until 11:10 p.m. His mother had been in the hospital undergoing surgery, and he was in the care of an aunt. He liked to stay out late and usually did not return home until about 9:30 p.m. Once, he left the house in the early morning hours and accidentally locked himself out. His parents installed a special lock on the door to prevent this event from occurring again. When Lewis did not come home late in the evening of June 7 and did not answer his family's calls for him, they contacted police. An extensive search of the area turned up no clues to his whereabouts. Lewis enjoyed playing near water, particularly near Jordan Creek and Lehigh River, at the time of his disappearance. Shortly before he vanished, he mentioned that he would like to visit Dorney Park. No trace of him was found at any of those places. His parents took lie detector tests early on in the investigation and were ruled out as suspects in their son's disappearance. There were rumors that they had abused and/or neglected Lewis, but the social services investigated and found the allegations to be without merit. Lewis's parents have 3 other children, 2 boys and a girl. He is their second oldest child. In January of 1984, Lewis told his parents, his school's nurse, and a psychologist that he had been molested by a couple named Frank and Elizabeth. His accounts of the alleged incident differed. Once he said he had been molested on the railroad tracks near Jordan Street and the Lehigh River, and another time he said Frank and Elizabeth had driven him to an apartment in Allentown and molested him there before taking him back to his own neighborhood. There may have been more than one incident. Lewis stated the couple threatened to hurt him if he told anybody about what they had done. The Allentown police were notified, but they could not find enough evidence to warrant an investigation, as Lewis could not provide any last names or addresses in his accounts. It is not known whether abuse incidents, if they actually happened, had anything to do with Lewis's disappearance 6 months later. In 1988, David Riggs, a self-proclaimed private investigator from New York who claimed to have founded an organization called Search 7 to look for Lewis and other missing children, was arrested in West Virginia after he accosted 5 young boys and offered to pay them to pose wearing bikini underwear. None of the boys took him up on the offer. Riggs pleaded guilty to 2 counts of attempted child abduction and 1 count of sexual abuse in connection with the incidents and was sentenced to a year in prison. Investigators looked into the possibility that he was involved in Lewis's abduction, but they found no evidence indicating this, and he was eventually ruled out as a suspect. He was at one time a doctoral candidate at Columbia University, and he has previously served time in prison, but not for child abuse-related crimes. Riggs does not have a private investigator's license in New York, and the organization he had supposedly founded, Search 7, is not registered as a non-profit corporation in that state. 11 months after Lewis disappeared, his family moved into the house on Chew Street that he liked to visit. The elderly female friend of Lewis's who had lived there was moving to a retirement home, and Lewis's family wanted to be at a place he knew and might return to. He had often played at the residence and had dreamed of living there someday. Lewis's parents were unable to make the mortgage payments for the home, in spite of contributions from community members who were moved by their plight. They filed for bankruptcy and moved to Leppert, Pennsylvania in 1989. The Chew Street residence has been vacant since that time. Lewis is described as friendly and talkative, but a loner and a timid child who was afraid to sleep alone. He had a short attention span and had trouble writing and paying attention in school. Because of this, he was due to enter a class for learning disabled students in the fall of 1984. Lewis was born near Stanhope, New Jersey, and moved to the Allentown area in June of 1983, a year before his disappearance. His case remains unsolved. He is believed to have been abducted by a non-family member. His parents believe he may be alive and may not remember who he is.
Number 8.
Lewis was last seen at his home on North Gardner Avenue in the Wilshire district of Los Angeles, California on December 13, 1980. He disappeared together with his wife, Betty, sometime between 6:15 and 9 p.m., and neither of them have ever been heard from again. When authorities checked the Balas residence, they found the front door open and a set of keys still in the lock, the television set turned on, and the bathtub filled with water. There were no indications of a struggle, and the only items that appeared to be missing were the couple's car and the car keys. The Balas' maroon four-door 1978 Cadillac was found the next day in a vacant lot off Crenshaw Boulevard, near the Santa Monica Freeway, and 7 miles from the Balas' home. There were no bloodstains in or on the vehicle. The Balases vanished the day before Lewis was supposed to testify against Larry Eugene Boyce, who on October 31, 1978, had allegedly attacked him in a bank parking garage, robbed him and threatened his life. Boyce, who had previously served 8 years in prison for murder, was out on bail at the time Lewis and Betty disappeared. In December 1980, he was scheduled to go to trial for a total of 14 felonies, including kidnapping and robbing Lewis. Dozens of other witnesses were also scheduled to testify against Boyce, and it hasn't been proven that Betty and Lewis's disappearances were related to the upcoming trial. He was ultimately convicted of a variety of charges, including kidnapping Lewis, and sentenced to life in prison plus 33 years. Foul play is suspected in the Balas' cases. Investigators believe up to 3 individuals, including a woman who may have been pregnant at the time, were involved in their disappearances. The cases remain unsolved.